somebody mentioned in the comments that they put the panels back on to protect the fuel tanks from overheating in the sun. And of course, we all know that the fuel tanks would be empty and they have been vented. Here's the article that has been written to justify going or skirting around the radiation belts. Here's the 3-degree off plane. They put this nice red line in it. That's 3 degrees off the equator, if you can imagine that. And they've got mathematical formulas to prove that it is. See how they pull this around and it comes in, this is supposed to be the Earth here, and it goes around the edge, and it goes around the edge this way, and they do it from all different directions. But they're doing it on a 2-dimensional. There's a number of authors' references that they've got in here that they're working on.
Okay.
And that includes so-called the original. Here they've got the number of this for Apollo 11 command module here and here in that they're using. And that's what they're trying to refer it back to, claiming that those are exactly the same as the simulations. And here, they actually take this image of this path going around this way, and then they turn it and make it go this way around. Interesting mathematics they use.
If you're going to go from the Earth to the Moon, you can see where the Moon is. It varies its position, admittedly, but not by that much. Maybe a few degrees, so you've got to point at the Moon. If it's 3 degrees above the equator that you would do translunar injection, that's fair enough. Because once you've shut off your rockets after the translunar injection, you're coasting all the way to the Moon. I don't know if they did any mid-course corrections on the way to the Moon.
3 on the way. See, the radiation data, they're saying here, it corresponds to it right there.
Yeah.
That's the first thing. Corresponds to the original. And then they come down and make one more statement. It says it was exactly the same as what the simulations were and the actual data from the mission. They're saying that it's exactly the same as indicated in the mission report included in the velocity vector and calculated with this exactly as the original document of the mission report. And for the numerical simulation following a different equation, they throw a little bit of math in here to do it to show that this is the gravitational constant and all of this stuff on here was exactly as they had calculated and simulated before, showing that this is how they got around the belts. And that did not happen because it's not in those documents unless they've recreated them. But how do you get 3 degrees off this equatorial plane using these angles like this? That's only 3 degrees as far as they're concerned. And then this one curves, which is even different. But now, if they're going to make all of this claim here, now they have to go back and they have to show the amount of fuel that was burnt to take this maneuver around and then correct it back to point it at the Moon. The one point they didn't do it is here is where's the position of the Moon? Well, it's 3 degrees off the equator, out that way. They can't go around this direction. They're not pointing the right way. You're going to need one hell of a ton of fuel to get back on course if they made that correction. And now they have to add a whole bunch more fuel back into their system to correct what they did in this document. And that's the problem. When they change one, they have screwed up hundreds of other documents. All their fuel requirements, their weight requirements, their liftoff requirements all have to change right from the ground up just to make that one adjustment. And then they've got to spend billions of dollars getting guys to create all the new mathematical formulas and everything else and write the PDF files. That took them 5 years to create that. As soon as we started talking about them not going through the Van Allen belts, they claimed 2012 or 13 that Brainiac guy did.
Yep.
So they've been working on that ever since to produce this document. And what it does is it messes with a whole bunch of other documents because of what they said in this document.
And if they're using Robert Braunick's calculations, they've got to try to validate what he said, because he's talking from NASA's viewpoint. They've got to then try and make it correct, so they use all these mathematical equations, which probably not many people can actually fully understand. Maybe a few people.
Well, that's why they can lie and say it was in the original documents, and it was included in the mission report from Apollo 11.
Wouldn't all of this have to have been calculated and worked out before they sent these astronauts into those belts or beyond
That's
them?
what they claim that happened.
Of course they would.
They would have had to. So then why are they fudging all of these numbers these days then?
Because more and more people are not only challenging them, like we are, but have done the calculations themselves. And enough people are questioning whether what NASA said happened actually did happen. And they're demonstrating that it couldn't have happened. And that's very embarrassing for NASA. So they have to come up with explanations which sound mathematically correct for what they did. It's basically becoming a game now. Who's got the most complex mathematical equation to demonstrate the path of the rocket?
If you've got 5 different PDF files and they're all different, not everybody's reading all 5.
Yeah.
They read the one and they believe it.
Yep.
That's it. Well, these guys have tried to tie it together and tried to say that the original documents, they had already worked out this path to skirt around the Van Allen belts.
Well, let's see where the original documents state that they did.
Well, that's what they were trying to claim, but the original documents said that they fired up to do the trans-lunar injection from the antipode.
Yep.
Is when they fired. It comes around 3 degrees north of the equator, so they're 3 degrees below, going to 3 degrees north.
Yep.
Got up to about 80% of the speed when the third stage cut off, and the CSM had to fire to bring it up to injection speed, the final stage in there, which means that they have fired that engine many, many times by the time they come through there, because they needed to do course corrections, which I have looked at. They don't state if they're just using those off the retro rockets or the main engine when they do the course corrections. And the retros wouldn't do anything for them. They would just turn you around. You're just floating in space, right? And then they still need that engine to thrust your way back. But the fuel requirements that it would take to skirt around the edge, you'd need at least another Saturn V rocket. To change the direction from the equator, before you get to the Van Allen belts, you're going to be doing this, you have to head north. They're showing that they head north and then curve it around the edge and then head back towards the moon. That's one hell of a pile of fuel, because you have to stop. You're traveling at 17.5 miles an hour, and then you're going to turn left and head north. Marcus, you can verify it's actually in the transcript as well. When they cross over the eye of whatever.
Oh, Rishat structure.
Rishat structure.
They cross over that, and that shows their flight path.
Yeah.
If they're crossing over that. Not this diagram that they put here. That thing's over 40 degrees on an angle shooting there above the equator. And there's absolutely no way. These guys, they put their little PhDs behind it, and they put their lab coats on, and they think they're an authority. Well, these guys also cannot do any practical research on their own.
No.
They're parrots.
They have to rely on NASA, because if they go against the official story, NASA's official story, they're frozen out, and they won't be able to get any more funding.
Right.
So they have to do it. So they can do the most complex calculations you like to prove that this happened. But it's much simpler to prove it didn't happen. And you just go back to the original documents, look at the original path, as you say. They launched from Florida. They passed over Mauritania, where the Rishat structure is, which is in northwest Africa.
Yeah.
And then they carried on around there. We're always told that the trans-lunar injection rocket was fired over the Pacific, so nobody could see it, probably. After their 2.5 orbits, they fired the trans-lunar injection. Unless they invalidated Newton's first law of motion, which says an object will remain in motion until acted upon by another force.
Right.
They have to come up with the other force, and there isn't one. Well, the other force would be the firing of the rocket, and that maintains the position.
Well, they needed to get that thrust and slingshot activity coming from the backside of the moon around to get that acceleration in there. And as you're coming by there, you got about a 6,000 mile acceleration path that it's running on. And then the third stage is dropped at that point. Then they release the descent and ascent stages and put them back together onto the CSM. and then they hit the final stage of thrust to pull them up to escape velocity after they do that. And that's well documented. There's videos, there's animations that have been done on it, and these guys just discredited all of that.
Yeah.
Because none of those show that path.
No, they don't. And that paper from Robert Browning was taken down. It was removed from the internet.
And these guys put it back up again.
It was so wrong. He didn't get it correct. I mean, Gerald White's looked at it very closely.
Everybody's taken them down from it. Even the first time I looked at it, right? And I looked back through the original documentations on it. Whatever they've done there, I don't know why they would bother to put that up, because they should have looked at it and said it's going straight in the shredder. It absolutely discredits every other document NASA has written to date.
Yeah, good point.
But you see, here's the other thing, is when you look at that Palacia film, and look at all of the mathematics that one fella used to try to prove that this was going 10% slower than what was expected. And then we have a look at it, and it doesn't even show the separation. He just sees a big puff of smoke. And what good does that mathematics do? It's worthless.
All that's coming off of that is the vapor, and when it hits a certain height, you can't run moisture any higher than that. You're only at 40,000 feet when that's coming off. And they claim that's when it was going supersonic, which it's not.
No, and it still needed to go another 1 minute and 10 seconds before it hit supersonic, according to that film.
Yeah. But when you get to a certain height, that vapor ring that was building around the craft is condensing it. It's the same as you get when you see a plane land and you get the vapor trails off the edge of it.
So here Browning does all of these calculations, and it's exactly the same as the Palacia film. He did all these fancy calculations, and because he didn't understand that that was not the point of where the F-5s were ejected, all that mathematics means nothing. And it was the same with Browning's paper. All that mathematics is now for nothing.
The thing is they're paying these people big money. They're spending piles of money trying to defend something that never happened. And it's 52 years later. That's the problem. They're spending more money today on that than their original budget was.
By the way, just check the original documentation. The Apollo 11, this was written on July the 6th. That was when it was published, 1969, 10 days before Apollo 11 launched. Earth Parking Orbit, EPO, that's what it says. Apollo 11 will remain in Earth parking orbit for 1 1/2 revolutions after insertion, and will hold a local horizontal attitude during the entire period. The crew will perform spacecraft systems check in preparation for the translunar injection. The final go will be given to the crew over Carnarvon, Australia. Carnarvon being one of the tracking stations. And then translunar injection, midway through the second revolution of the Earth parking orbit, the S-1VB third stage engine will restart at 2 hours 44 minutes 15 seconds ground elapsed time over the mid-Pacific, just south of the equator, to inject Apollo 11 towards the moon. The velocity will increase, obviously, if you fired a rocket, and it will increase up to 35,533 feet per second, about 25,000 miles an hour. Terminal velocity, increased velocity, etc. The point is they had to inject it into the moon orbit on a free return trajectory, so they had to get it absolutely precise.
Exactly.
When it reached the moon, so that it could, if necessary, come back on a free return trajectory to Earth. So they had to get the initial point correct. There's no mention here at all of any skirting around radiation belts. Nothing at all. There's no mention of it at all. So all that hard work by, no doubt, lots of PhDs and important people at NASA is for nothing. It doesn't prove anything other than you're trying to falsify it.
I just figured that to make it simpler, they just tilt the radiation belts out of the way. Just tilt them up so they're not over the equator, and then put them back down again when they're done.
Yeah, no, it'd be a very sensible way. Just tilt the whole radiation belts out of the way, you can launch your rocket through it.
Yeah, and because they use that fuel-free return, that's their emergency abort path, right? Where they don't land, they just go once around and cruise back again. They still have to be on that plane, just that 3 degrees off of the Earth's equator to the moon to hit that thing. Because technically, if they could just free float around and do whatever they wanted, they could actually do a polar orbit coming back in and come in at the pole to re-enter, to skirt the Van Allen belts. They can't take off like that because of the location of the launch pad.
Take off from Florida, fly out over Africa, skirt around, come in over the south of India, back in over South America. It's a standard orbit. And they had to obviously avoid the South Atlantic anomaly, which is where the radiation belts come down to within about 100 miles of the Earth. And interestingly, when spacecraft, including the ISS, orbit through the South Atlantic anomaly, they have to switch their computers off in case they get fried.
The one thing that article does state, and it's this part that they don't state, that the radiation belts are deadly and they have to go around them.
This person said that there was 7 millimeters of lead inside of the command module.
Well, that's what she was told by the Space Foundation, to whom she asked the question. How did the command module and the astronauts survive the radiation? 7 millimeters of lead. Now, it turned out that she'd misread the documents, and it was 7 millimeters of aluminium honeycomb structure. Dear, oh dear.
Actually, some of the articles you read, it's actually a negative when the radiation penetrates through because it modifies it into X-rays and microwaves.
It's not a very nice environment to be in.
And of course, once it gets inside, it's just going to keep bouncing around, and then those windows don't help.
No, they won't help.
They just let it in.
What's the plan to have lead across all the windows too? You wouldn't be able to see much, would you? Let's say the evidence doesn't support the fact that any radiation shielding was used, because aluminium does not shield against radiation. Otherwise you'd go into your dental x-ray wearing an aluminium apron. No, you wear a lead apron.
And don't forget those spacesuits, they x-rayed them to show what was inside them, so they don't protect at all.
They don't protect. So it's because people like us keep asking those questions, how did they protect against radiation, that they have to come up with something. They'd rather ignore it, they'd rather not talk about it, because it's not something that can be discussed realistically, certainly not by the powers that be. And I noticed that even SpaceX are not discussing it at all.
No, they're not. They don't have anything. There was a program that was running, and I forget what it was, on the Science Channel or something, talking about Musk, Bezos, and Branson, the three of them together. The Space Barons, I think, they were talking about. I guess it's a good investment for them because of all the funding they get. They must make a hell of a lot of money.
It's a good money-making scheme. I mean, Musk is very good at that. He can persuade people to pay him everything.
Yeah.
You know, he flies the astronauts up to the space station, takes all their rubbish back down again, then produces something that will fly to the moon. Well, I'd love to see it.
But he's tested it. I mean, I've seen lots of tests of that thing flying on its belly, testing the fins out, making sure it lands. I mean, he's done a few tests, but it hasn't gone very far. Well,
no, he hasn't gone into orbit. He's gone up and come down again. Put the fins out, landed the thing. But that's quite an achievement in itself. It's gone up about, 6-10 miles, something like that.
Look at how many years it took to develop the computer technology to control that machine, and the number of failures that it took, unexpected disassembly of equipment. I was sitting considering the fact that, you know, with the Downey Studios and their multi-billion-dollar zero-gravity simulator that they're putting in there, and that's a production studio, that's not a training facility, but I think the best way they can use their abilities is to stop using rockets and fuel and stuff like that. They need to actually fake that they have developed a transporter. And that way, we'll be able to see people get to Mars. They can transport all of the buildings and equipment and everything else there. and they can have it right on the Downey Studios set, and that way they don't have to have these guys worried about radiation and vacuum and everything else. They can transport them right to Mars, and that's easy enough to fake because we've seen it since the 1960s, Star Trek. They don't have to worry about all of this nonsense and all the money they're wasting on these launch pads and stuff like that, right? They can just transport people there, and that's how we're going to see people walking on Mars. They need to have a new vehicle to get anywhere, right? And a transporter would be the exact device to create the illusion. Illusion.